Hello children, good morning. Today we are going to discuss about the topic is evolution and classification. So we can do the evolutionary relationship by identifying the hierarchies of characteristics between the species. What is meant by hierarchies of characteristics? Hierarchy, which means we need to order the organisms starting from the kingdom to end from the species. So in the previous classes, we can see about the classification of organisms. You can recall those chapters. In these chapters, I have taught you about the kingdom, phylum, genera and everything. So that is called as hierarchy. If we need to find out the evolutionary relationship between the organisms, initially we need to categorize the organism based upon the hierarchy of characteristics. Similarities among organisms will allow us to group them and then study the groups. So which or the organism do have the same similarities. So all the organism is categorized into the same groups. For this, which characteristics design more fundamental differences among organisms and which one design less basic difference. So what is meant by characteristics? Characteristics is nothing but it is a detailed appearance or else it is otherwise called as behavior of an organisms. Example, we have four limbs. So those organism which has four limbs, so all the organism is categorized into same group. The plant can do photosynthesis. This is the basic characteristic of the plant. So whichever the plant can do photosynthesis, so all the plants is categorized into the same group. Some basic characteristics will be shared by most organisms. For example, cell is a basic unit of all living organisms. So all the organism is made up of cell. So this is the basic characteristics. This characteristic will be shared by most of the organism. But the characteristics in the next level of classification would be shared by most of the organisms but not all the organisms. For example, cell is a basic unit of all the organisms. So this is the character which can be shared by all the organisms. But in the character, a basic characteristics of cell design that differ among different organisms, whether the cell has a nucleus or not. So whichever the organism contains nucleus, that will be categorized into same group. Whichever the organism doesn't contain nucleus, so those organisms will be categorized into different group. For example, bacterial cell doesn't have any nucleus, so the DNA, it will be as such in the cell cytoplasm itself. So the bacteria will be categorized into different groups. So those organisms which has nucleus, that will be categorized into next group. Among the organisms with nucleated cells. So coming to the organisms which contain nucleus, in that organism group, which ones are unicellular and which ones are multicellular. Unicellular, which means those organisms which is made up of single cell. Multicellular, which means those organisms which is made up of many number of cells. So initially we categorize the organism is the organism which is made up of cell. The next category is the cell, whether it contains nucleus or not. So the next category is if the organism it contains a nucleus. Again, the organism will be classified into two types, unicellular organism or else multicellular organisms. So that property marks a very basic difference in body design because of specialization of cell types and tissue. Unicellular organism doesn't have any tissues or organs, but multicellular organisms, it is made up of specialized tissues and organs for the functions of the body. See, next, among the multicellular organisms, whether those organisms can undertake photosynthesis or not will provide the next level of classifications. So those organisms which can able to do photosynthesis, for example, plant, some organisms, it can able to do photosynthesis. So those organisms is coming under multicellular organisms. In the same multicellular organisms, example animal, they cannot able to perform photosynthesis. So those animals will be categorized into different group. So multicellular organism, now it will be categorized into Plantae and Animalia. Next, among the multicellular organisms that cannot do photosynthesis, whether the skeleton is inside the body or around the body, will mark another fundamental design difference. Again, it is coming under Animalia. In that Animalia, the skeleton which is present inside the body or else which is around the body. So, depending upon the presence of skeleton in the body, again the organism is categorized into two groups. A hierarchy is developing that allow us to make classification of the groups. The more characteristics of two species will have in common, the more closely they are related. So whichever the two species, it is going to share more closely related characteristics. So those organisms are very closely related organisms. And the more closely they are related, the more recently they will have the common ancestors. So whichever the organism is coming under more closely related species, so those organism is going to share the common ancestor, which means they are evolved from the common ancestor. Example, a brother and a sister. They are closely related one. Why? Because they have the common ancestor. Who is the common ancestor here? Their parents. They evolved. They are generated from their parents. So the brother and sister are closely related. They have a common ancestor in the first generation, before generation, namely their parents. They are evolved from their parents. They are formed from their parents. Another example, a girl and her first cousin. They are also a related but less than the girl and her brother. Why? Because the girl and her first cousin, they have the common ancestor in the second generation, which means their grandparents, but not in the first generation. Their parents are not similar, but their grandparents are same for both the girl and the first cousin. See, this is because cousins have common ancestor, their grandparents, in the second generation but not in the first one. We can thus build up small group of species with recent common ancestor, then super group of these groups with more distant common ancestor and so on. By using this hierarchy of classification, we can able to identify which among the species has recent common ancestor and which among the species have more distant common ancestors. Okay children, I hope you all understood about this evolution topic very well. If you have any queries, you can call me. I'll clarify your doubts. Thank you.